Studies. My name is Gary Kramer. I'm the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and this is one of the many events planned in commemoration of Missouri's bicentennial statehood. Among our strong bicentennial alliance partners is the Missouri Humanities Council, which offers a Native American program to increase our understanding of the American Indian experience in Missouri. This morning, we are pleased to have Native Heritage speaker Galen Gritts, a lifelong St. Louisan and a tribal member of the Cherokee Nation, to relate the story of the historic tribes in Missouri and their forced removal from their home by the United States government. Galen will tell us what it's like to be a Native person in Missouri and about the continued presence and importance of Indigenous peoples to the future of Missouri history, life, and culture. Galen.
Nancy Sinatra's boots may have been made for walking, but mine are very slick, so I have to walk out when I come up something like that. Osta Sanalali, Dakwadoa Galen Gritts, Chalasi, Sadalawa E. Degega E. St. Louis, Wado. Good morning, my name is Galen Gritts. I'm a Cherokee from St. Louis. I was born and raised there, or reared there, and thanks. Thanks for inviting me here to this beautiful building on this beautiful day for this beautiful occasion. Thanks for taking the time. I always learn many things myself when I do these presentations, and honored and thrilled to do them. My Cherokee pedigree is that I am a member of the Wolf Clan, which happens to be the largest clan of the Cherokee Nation, and there are 7 clans altogether. The other 6 clans are the Long Hair, the Blue, the Wild Potato, Deer, Bird, and Paint. There was an 8th clan at one time, the Bear Clan, but Bear did not like being human, so he went back to being an animal. Perhaps you were at the tree dedication this past hour at the Flat Branch Park here in Columbia. Native people and memorial trees have been swirling around my life the last couple of weeks. 10 days ago, I participated in the first virtual meeting of Native people in St. Louis regarding a trail tree that's being planted at Washington University. There are about 800 trail trees in the United States. They are bent on purpose, deliberately, to act as signs, normally for things such as fords and rivers or trailheads or things of that nature. Not having written languages, it was important for natives to have this way of communicating. And then just this past week, out of the blue, I learned that there is a community building on the land that once belonged to my great-grandfather, my grandfather, where my father was raised. And I visited quite often as a child in northeastern Oklahoma, about 2 hours from Joplin. And back in the day when there was no air conditioning in cars. The community center recently was built in '94. We had no idea it was there. And recently, within the last couple of weeks, the Cherokee Nation has given $250,000 for it to be updated. They're putting a portico in the middle of it so elders can easily access it. They can come in out of the rain or heat and also not have to walk as far, going from one end to the other. They can come into the middle. And there's talk of another grant on its way. There's a strong movement to name the community center after my father, who was a Cherokee artist. He ended up, after being a fine artist, the art director for the Sporting News in St. Louis, which is why I ended up in St. Louis. But in any case, she gave strict instructions, the lady that's in charge of this. It's been her dream for years, that when it was built, and even now as it's being remodeled, that they don't take down any of the trees, because she is a member of the Cherokee Nation. She strongly believes that those trees have memories of my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my father himself. In that case, perhaps they might remember me from our many visits down to Oklahoma, generally during the summer when school was out. Like the time I snuck out my older brother's BB gun. Now, my parents could care less whether I had a BB gun or not, but I did not have one. My brother did. A year older, he was cool, and I was pond scum in his eyes. So he would let me use it now and again, and we would take shots at marks on trees or rocks, or quite often toy soldiers and tanks we had set up. But I did not have permission that day, so I was out in the yard in Oklahoma. I took aim at a small bird on a fence, and I got it at the first shot. I was horrified because it fell to the ground dead. I don't know what I was expecting, but I stood over it as a skinny, pencil-neck, knobby-knee kid in shorts, kid of 8, staring into the abyss. And I realized, to my shame, that my actions had consequences. I would like to recognize the Osage, or the Osage, in the Missouri, tribes on whose land we are now occupying. The state is named after the Missouri. The last member of that tribe died in 1985. The Osage were the predominant tribe in what is now Missouri by the time that the Spanish and then the French showed up. In 1808, the Osage were forced to sign a disingenuous treaty making absurd concessions to leave all of Missouri, parts of Kansas, and Arkansas for a tiny piece of land in Kansas. Eventually, they left that land down around Coffeyville and moved to northern Oklahoma to a county called Osage County, and that's where their tribal government is located to this day. In addition, other tribes who were in Missouri in historical times when white people started to show up, and this is over a span of time. They weren't all here necessarily at the same time. The Oto, the Sauk and Fox, the Iowa, the Kansas, the Illini, the Kickapoo, the Peoria, Shawnee, Delaware, Sioux, Piankashaw, and the Cherokee. Now, some were in parts of the state when the Osage were here, and others moved into the state and perhaps further on as a pressure from the Americans, the encroachment for land, and often death that accompanied their arrival, they came through as well. Keep in mind, as they came through, all the tribes were losing numbers due to diseases they had no immunity to and not having access to food sources like they had before, those kind of things. So it was an ever-decreasing presence that they had. And I am mindful that these people continue a sacred relationship with the lands that we now occupy. And I recognize and appreciate the integral contributions to the cultural heritage, not only of this state, but of our nation's history as well. Since when the tribes in Missouri were here, there was no written language. All the ideas that we have, their historical times, were through the European and American focus because they did have written languages. So when we go look back and look at the records, we're looking through the lens of the dominant culture. It is a colonial perspective that we know of, how we define Native people. Over time, they were stripped of their property, language, culture, and sometimes their very children through boarding schools. And so the Indians have largely been left out of the nation's story and marginalized, except in a distorted and often a romanticized kind of a way. When they are thought of, it's often in caricature. For us, people of a certain age, when there were a lot of Westerns on TV and in movies, those characters are living in teepees, riding horses and attacking covered wagons, wearing headdresses and grunting how. Obviously, those are the Plains Indians. You didn't live that way in the state of Maine. You didn't live that way in North Carolina. You didn't live that way in the bayous of Louisiana. They were Native people not only over this entire country, but over the entire Western Hemisphere, living many different ways with many different cultures. And yet we have this dwarf vision of them. Ever since the 70s, and perhaps with the movie more lately than that, with Kevin Costner in it, we are often thought of as being innately spiritual, connected to the earth, being some kind of super ecologist. So that's a stereotype as well. So we will restore aspects of their identity today. This first step is to recognize that they were here. And so the tree planted earlier, a living thing created by God, will be a remembrance of them. Also living things created by God. Now the picture behind me was taken in June at the Trail of Tears Park, just north of Cape Girardeau. My wife and I like to go on hikes, not exhaustive hikes, but hikes enough. And you can see stones as a memorial on the trunk of this tree that had fallen. And often when we go on these hikes, we find things like this, little piles of stone that hikers have left. In the Old Testament, an Ebenezer is actually a reference to a kind of remembrance. It's a pile of stone, I think in the book of Samuel. And there's other Old Testament stories about leaving piles of stone, but that's where the name Ebenezer comes from. And that brings a new meaning to Charles Dickens' Christmas story, doesn't it? Why he named him that. Scrooge, obviously, is pretty universal what that means, knowing his character in the beginning of the book, but Ebenezer is perhaps a reference to how he became at the end, after meeting the ghosts. I'm sure there must be a dissertation somewhere in this country about that. My point is, though, that this is not a paganistic spirit worshiping. When you set up a memorial like this, we're not worshiping the spirit of the tree or the spirit of stones. These are statements of relationships. Now, Native people's occupancy of what is now Missouri was fluid. The state was founded in 1821, and obviously the boundaries of the state before that, the Native people had no awareness when they crossed the Missouri to go to Illinois from Arkansas, and sometimes they traveled quite far for food sources. And of course, after the state boundaries were set, immediately after, they didn't care because they didn't know about boundaries. They didn't know about owning land. And so the story I heard in the 4th grade about selling Manhattan for $24 worth of trinkets, it was to make a point of how smart the Dutch were. Well, it was not the same playing field. The Native people had no idea what they were being bargained out of. Archaeology tells us that Native societies are thought to have existed in what is now this state for 12,000 to 14,000 years before the arrival of the Europeans. And the UN World Heritage Site at Cahokia Mounds, right across the river from the St. Louis Arch. Now, a World Heritage Site is like the Roman Colosseum or Taj Mahal. We have one right here, real close to the state. It was had hundreds of satellite locations all over Missouri. And in fact, St. Louis itself was known as Mound City in early records because there were so many Indian mounds. Of course, what they did was level them and to fill in swamps and low places. There's only one in existence now. It's called Sugarloaf Mound on the south side of the city. It's only half there, and it was recently deeded to the Osage Nation. So they actually own some land now back in what used to be their home state. Of course, the Mississippian people, as they were known as, were only one of many prehistoric groups of people that lived in Missouri. The Mississippian culture flourished in the Midwest, eastern and southeastern areas of the U.S. from approximately 800 AD or CE, depending on how you use it, to 1600 AD or CE. The Mississippian way of life began to develop in the Mississippi River Valley, which is why it was named that. And almost all the sites date before the arrival of Hernandez de Soto to the area. But the furthest north he got was de Soto, Missouri, southeast or west of St. Louis. And of course, he explored Arkansas and a number of places. Now, imagine taking a boat ride around the island of Manhattan, one of those tour boat rides, and after a couple of hours of entertaining and educational information, and the captain informs you that what you just saw was not Manhattan, you would be confused and surprised, right? Well, let us be clear. The area that we call Missouri today is not really the same place where the native people thrived before the arrival of the whites. And that's because 85% of the wetlands of Missouri, which there were a lot of, have been destroyed since the dominant culture showed up. And what that does is change the actual physical nature of this state, the structure, the topography, the fauna, the flora, and even the soundscape, what you hear on a day-by-day basis, on an hour-by-hour basis. This happened in a state which hosts the continent's largest water system and is home to many whitewater rivers and streams. We have engineered the unthinkable by changing the very soul of the land and now live on this side of the divide. So it's hard for us to realize what it was like before. But the chasm between where the native people lived before encroachment and invasion and where we live is almost as profound as living on different planets. The largest natural occurring lake in the whole state is a small lake, and I'm very familiar with it, in West St. Louis County, Creve Coeur Lake. It's not very big at all. It's an old oxbow of the Missouri River. So all the present-day lakes that we have are created by damming rivers, construction of dams. Running water and wetland once defined and ruled in this state. They have water, either standing water or water saturated in the soil at some time during the growing season. And acre for acre, wetlands support more diversity and abundance of living thing than any other ecosystems. Even most kind of farmlands cannot match the productivity of wetlands. They reduce flood damage by storing water during heavy rains. They act as filters for pollutants. They keep lakes and rivers pure. In dry times, they recharge groundwater, and the wetland plants stabilize the soil against erosion. So, how did Native people live in Missouri prior to first contact? Well, number one, they had their identity tied to the land. You didn't own the land, but the land defined you. It was a connection to their ancestors and to God. The idea of land was relational. So there was no individual property. It was a gift that yielded food and shelter, medicine, knowledge, and non-human kinfolk, that is, animals. Now, the kinship with animals is evident in my earlier telling of the Cherokee clans and how Bear went back to being a human. So that was an example of that. Native people were excellent observers and inventors. They had great ability to be in the moment. Many native languages have more verbs than Indo-European languages. The Algonquin language is 90% verbs. I find it useful to think of native people of yesteryears as verbs rather than nouns. They were both a state of being and action. Most of what they used was biodegradable. Their food was locally sourced, non-GMO. It was organic, and their game was grass-fed. So all these things are on culinary, you might call it a fad, but not maybe, or talked about quite often in food right now. Their fast food was actually fast. You had to run after it and catch it. And since it was grass-fed, it was lean and fat, and you were lean at that time. Native folks often bathe in running water. This is one reason why we're thought of as being savage, because we bathe. Many tribes did. As mentioned, we had more whitewater rivers and streams than anywhere else in the world, plenty of places to bathe. Native people achieved their caloric intake quite easily. I mean, we live in one of the plushest areas of the planet. And so they had a good proportion of necessary nutrients. They obtained protein, this is interesting to me, primarily through fish. Forget the Warner Brothers cartoon of a young Indian boy stalking a bird with a bow and arrow, like a hapless Elmer Fudd. Missouri Indians fished. The nets they used for that, they could also be used for catching fowl. Without dams and levees, there were much more water for fowl. Waterfowl was their second largest, biggest source of protein. And lastly, they hunted for protein sources. And of course, deer, rabbit, turkey, and squirrel come to mind very easily today. But at the time, there were buffalo, beaver, and elk in the state. Gardening provided plenty of food with complex carbohydrates. There was a variety of nuts to gather. To this day, in this world, 70% of the produce consumed comes from native agriculture. Potatoes, corn, peppers, tomatoes, pumpkins, and the list goes on and on. Developing new plants intentionally, domesticating things, is an invention. So 70% of what the world eats today was invented by native people. The Indian invention of corn had a big of an impact on the native world as the microchip has had on our world. It was a game changer. When Auguste Chouteau arrived in Missouri in 1764 to found what became the city of St. Louis, the average Frenchman was 4 feet 11 inches tall. The average Osage ranged from 6 feet to 6 feet and a half tall. That's living right. Native families in Missouri took about 8 hours a week per adult to produce the food that they needed to eat for the week. Compare that to modern families having 2 breadwinners and often working 40 hours or more. And that does not count the time commuting or going to the grocery store. With no written language, both the family and tribal groups were sources of knowledge. Elders were respected for what they knew. Think of them as the Google of their time. If you wanted to know something, you asked an elder. They were not warehoused in assisted living or skilled nursing barracks. They lived with the people. In contrast, the dominant culture was extractive. Its people needed property rights and capital. They viewed nature as a resource, not as a relative. Early industries included smelting metals. Cannonballs from Herculaneum were used in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. The lead was just dropped off the bluffs of the Mississippi, and by the time it hit the sand down below, it was a cannonball, and then you just shipped it down the river. Massey Iron Works was started in 1825 near St. James. Its founders learned of the iron from the local Native Americans. Missouri became a slave state to maximize the extraction of labor as a resource as well. Missouri towns and cities were founded as trailheads, linking to a network of complicated national and international markets with often volatile economic results with booms and busts. So first it was the rivers that we had, where towns were established, and then it was the railroads. But the whole reason you did that was you can get your corn, your product, to St. Louis, to New Orleans, to London. And you were really held captive by the silver, gold, what happened in New York. So even though you were living a little town of the prairie kind of a life, or a Pollyanna life in a small town, your financial situation was way beyond your control. Had things to do with international and national markets. That's why the beaver trade fueled early St. Louis growth was all about Englishmen's hat, because beaver hats were then all the rage in London, and that's simply the reason. It was fashion, not even for women, but for men. Europeans and Americans rarely bathed at the time of first contact. They thought it would lead to disease because of their experience with the bubonic plague and so forth, and that the human body nude was sexual. So quite frankly, the early Missourians stank. And that's why the French developed, and the Germans as well, colognes and perfumes, because Europeans didn't like bathing. I think it was Queen Isabella of Columbus fame, who's famously claimed she only bathed twice, once when she was born and once when she was married. Poor Ferdinand. And the reverse of the story that I heard as a kid, that the brave pioneers, I'm not demeaning them by any means, but you don't leave your home if it's comfortable. So the people that came across the ocean were somewhat unhappy. The culture and society they grew up in were seen as dangerous and forced them to flee, whether it was England or Germany, or once they got here, if they left Virginia or Kentucky to come to Missouri. Something wasn't right at home, or you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't take your family and expose them to river or sea crossings and sinking of boats or diseases or not having a job or not having anything here. So if you think about it, they had made a mess of their own home situation as a culture, and they had to leave. It'd be like us having terrible things happening in Missouri and decided to move to Mozambique. There had to be a very strong push to get us to do that, as there were for the people that came to Missouri. In Europe, extreme concentration of wealth with nobles and the church and the king led to restricted opportunity and the lack of tolerance. People were killing each other over theological reasons, much less other reasons as well, threatened them. And that's one of the reasons they faced these challenging and dangerous situations. But at least they had the sense that concentrated wealth and intolerance were a danger. So the results of this exploitations were many and are still impacting the state today. Mark Twain, in his Life on the Mississippi, writes about the steamboat stopping every so often, which I had never thought about. I just recently read this book, to send logging parties ashore because you needed the wood in order to make the steam. And so they would stop every so often to chop down the trees on the banks, and thus creating the natural fauna and changing the riverbanks into erosion sluices. The average steamboat required 35 cords of wood a day. And a cord is 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. So all these hundreds and thousands of boats on the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Missouri are deforesting the rivers. There are 450 different species of bees, I should say, in Missouri. Not native bees, but bees. The honeybee, which is the one that most comes to most minds, is not native. It was brought over by the Spanish, as was the boar, or the pig, which becomes a boar very quickly, which is a nuisance throughout the state, as many others. Obviously, honeysuckle is not native. So things were brought over that also changed the nature of this. There are 17 native bees, by the way, that are only found in St. Louis and St. Louis County. So it's very interesting if you look at that perspective. Now, Missouri has, like a number of states, has medical and food deserts. And these are geographical areas that lack good medical help or good food sources. Some are in the inner city. Most of them tend to be in rural areas, and that's becoming more and more of a problem. You can't necessarily get the best food that's not processed except perhaps at a Walmart. And so many of the rural medical facilities are closing right now. But in Missouri, we also have a Native American desert. So along with Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, and Tennessee, we have no federally recognized tribes living here. Kansas has 4 reservations. They're small. Obviously, Oklahoma, chock full of Native people. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, other places, Oregon, even New York State has reservations. So what that does is remove us even further from the consciousness of people's minds. When I talk to people in Wisconsin, they might say, oh yeah, my brother dated a Native girl at college, or my cousin did this with a Native person. We don't have that visibility here in this desert in the middle of the country. And that shows up in the census. The census identified 6 million people in the state. Native Americans made up 0.6%, not even 1%. Now, on the national average, on all states thrown together, Native people make up 3%. So we're 5 times less than the national average here in Missouri. Now, of course, not that long ago, we made up 100% of the people. So that's a near perfect ethnic cleansing or a genocide, to have so many from the very tip of South America to the very northern part of the Arctic Circle, all Indians. So you can understand what natives like to say, party like it's 1491. There are about, and this always fluctuates, 573 federally recognized tribes today. And obviously the tribes have changed over time and continue to do so. There are some state-recognized tribes as well. Over time, many tribes were exterminated and some were blended because there were so few of them. The Seminoles of Florida aren't really a tribe. They are now, but they weren't in the beginning of this country. There were basically Choctaws and Chickasaws and Cherokees that fled into the swamps, along with a number of Irishmen from New Orleans who didn't like their lives that they were living, and some black slaves, or some even free blacks who didn't like the idea that they might be going back into slavery, and then some pirates from the Caribbean. And they hung out in the swamps and they became this group of people. And of all the Seminole Wars, 1 and 2, the United States Army never really did defeat them. And now they're a tribe. So that's an example of getting together and constituting. So this lack of a tribal organization in the center of this country that I just referred to was by deliberate design, really. It's not an accident. Gottfried Duden, who was a German immigration writer of the early 19th century, his book, Report of a Journey to the Western States of North America in a Multi-Year Sojourn in the Years 1824 through 1827, gave romantic and glowing descriptions of Missouri, the river valley between St. Louis and Herman. And it became a huge bestseller in Germany, in spite of its unwieldy title. He established a farm near what is Dutzau, Missouri, and his book on the region, comparing the Missouri River to the Rhine River in Germany, and his positive remarks concerning the climate, the culture, and the soil, led tens of thousands of German immigrations to the state of Missouri, starting in the 1830s. For example, by the time of the Civil War, in St. Louis, the majority of the St. Louisans were German-born. Not German descendant, but German-born. And by 1900, at the turn of the century, there were 6 daily newspapers being published in St. Louis that were in German. Of course, other groups of whites from Europe and the United States came to and through Missouri as well. So this ensuing flood of immigrants from Europe cherry-picked the land that was best for farming. Unfortunately, this land belonged to other people, the Indians, the Native Americans. And so for the most part, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee have good farming land at that time that farmers with their technology could actually use. So it was quickly taken from the Indians, who were conveniently pushed west into the plains of Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas. And so going from the verdancy of Missouri and living on the plains is quite different in one generation. Plus the fact that there were tribes already living out there quite successfully and quite warlike with the horse being introduced. And so they're thinking, what's up with these Indians from the east? You know, showing up where we are. And certainly we were not as warlike or as quick on horses as the Plains Indians were. So, of course, no good came of it. But what happened was The wooden plows could not break the sod of northern Missouri, parts of Iowa, certainly Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Dakotas. They broke because some of the roots of the grass go down 30 feet until you have John Deere and Cyrus McCormick invent metal plows. And interesting enough, they invented them about the same time that the Trail of Tears happened. They didn't come to market until really after the Civil War on a mass-produced area or mass-produced way. So, after the Native people all over this country defended their land through military action, or as we call it today, homeland security, which is what they were doing, the U.S. developed policies to remove them by treaty. Now, Hall of Famer Willie Keeler said the key to hitting in baseball is to hit them where they ain't. And the same can be said for U.S. Indian policy, send them where we ain't. So that meant setting the tribes out to places that no one wanted. And those are the Great Plains that I mentioned earlier. That's how the Sioux, originally from Wisconsin, ended up in Wisconsin and Minnesota, ended up in the Badlands of South Dakota, hence the name. The whites thought, well, no one will want to go out there. We'll send these people from Wisconsin and Minnesota out there. And then, of course, gold was discovered. One of these forced removals led to the Trail of Tears of my tribe, the Cherokee, who were from the southeast. And they were forced at bayonet point to leave to go to what was then known as the Great American Desert on the maps at the time, which later becomes the state of Oklahoma. So on their squalid march out to the Great American Desert on the Trail of Tears, of the 9 states, by the way, that the Trail of Tears crossed, Missouri has the most mileage. There were 3 routes that went across. But a quarter of them died. To put that in perspective, so far in this country, the death rate from COVID is less than 1%. It's 0.017%, so it's not even close to being 1%. The Spanish flu, which killed a lot more people at the turn of the 1900s, killed 5% of the world's population. So that was much more intense than what we have experienced with COVID to date. But neither of them come close to the 25% rate within a year or two that happened to the Cherokee Nation. Now, all deaths are to be mourned. I do not state this to lessen the impact of anyone's suffering and loss of life. I make this comparison because the personal effect of the Trail of Tears on the tribes that were forced to move is often diluted by the myth of inevitability. Forced relocation of Native American tribes to enrich oneself is a series of deliberate decisions made by individuals. It wasn't just one of those historical things that was bound to happen. Actions have consequences. Smallpox, I'm going to go aside for a second here, which ravaged the Native Americans, had a death rate of 90%. But that's a topic for another discussion. But it is worth mentioning. And that's why quite often when the explorers came to this country, they talk about Native Americans being everywhere. Close to New England, you couldn't go up the shore by Cape Cod without seeing town after town after town. But by the time the settlers came, it seemed like it was vacant because they had caught smallpox 20 years, 25 years before from the explorers. Now, as a lifelong St. Louis, and I have always thought that the Trail of Tears crossed the state somewhere down around St. Genevieve and Cape Girardeau, which one of the routes does indeed do. The northernmost route in Missouri, the one most traveled, actually comes within an hour of St. Louis near Steelville, Missouri. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred on December 29th between Christmas and New Year's in 1890 in South Dakota on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It involved the deaths of more than 250 and possibly 300 Lakota people, and I know Lakota descendants. They do not forget these things. We are an oral society, and we have a long memory. These people were guilty of no crime and were not engaged in combat. It was mainly old men, women, and children. So let's put that year, 1890, in some kind of perspective. Alexander Graham Bell was granted a patent for the telephone in 1876. In 1839, University of Missouri was founded. Is that the right direction? I think it is. Each bridge in St. Louis was completed in 1874, considered to be an engineering marvel at the time. 5 million people visited, I gotta have a drink of water, excuse me. 5 million people visited Coney Island, the fabled amusement park in Brooklyn, in New York City in 1890. And we had time to establish the first national park in Yosemite in 1890. So we have enough wealth and comfort to be seeking entertainment while these Indians are being slaughtered within the country. The 11th United States Census of 1890 had its data tabulated by machine for the first time in the history of the census. That company went on to become IBM. And what they found was there was 248,000 Indians, Native Americans living in, at that time, the 48 states. It was down quite a bit from the census before. But the rest of the country had 62,900,000 people. So in 1890, it's 248,000 versus 63 million. So next time you think of the Indian Wars and see a John Ford movies, or so the Indians massing around the covered wagons, that's not much of a fight. As stated previously, in 1808, the Osage were forced to sign a treaty to give up their land in Missouri. The other tribes who had a smaller presence and were generally passing through, such as the Shawnee, were gone as distinct groups by 1830. So there had been no Indians as an organization or a tribe or anything else in this country since the 1830s. And yet, the state of Missouri passes a law in 1899 making it illegal for American Indians to be in the state. The fine was $250 or 30 days in jail. That's minimum. There was no maximum fine established. At the same time, they passed a law making it illegal to provide Indians alcohol. Same fine, minimum $250 or 30 days. Now, it seems to me if you have the first law, you don't need the second law. But I'm not a state legislature, and I don't know how their minds work. And there's a reason I'm not a state legislature. But that may seem like a long time ago, but all my grandparents were alive in 1899, and I remember them very distinctly. TV shows, what they used to shave, what they like to eat, that's not that long ago. Might be for some of you younger people, but for the rest of us, not so much. In the early 1950s and 1960s, St. Louis was a city chosen to receive Native people from their rural homes under a new federal policy. And they were promised aid and vocational training if they would leave their tribal lands, which were considered backwards, and go to places like St. Louis. Chicago was one, San Francisco. Our famous late chief, Wilma Mankiller, went to San Francisco before she came back to Oklahoma and became chief of the nation. Very strong, powerful leader and strong, powerful woman. But they would come in to train to St. Louis at this train station, Union Station. And for the most part, there was no aid or training. So they just lived in ghettos, more or less. And that's how you have other tribes end up in St. Louis, at least, that have no connection to the state of Missouri because they came from places like New Mexico or Montana. None of the treaties that the United States government made with the Native tribes, any tribe at any time, was ever honored by the United States government. Does that surprise you? It's well known among Native people. None of them were ever kept. How about this? American Indians didn't become U.S. citizens till 1924. And sometimes we weren't allowed to vote in state elections. Maine, it wasn't until the 1970s. This, when as a group, Native people have served in all this country's war as a higher percentage than any other veteran group. Native Americans. My father was 9 when the Indian Citizen Act was passed by Congress. He served on a ship in World War II whose crew received the most medals of that war for a Navy vessel and was the worst damaged ship in the history of the United States Navy ever to come back to a U.S. port. He was discharged in 47, while he was still recovering from wounds he suffered in March of 45, near the end of the war, when they were 50 miles off the coast of Japan, preparing it for invasion. Most World War II servicemen were mustered out very quickly in 1945, between August and December, once the war ended in August. He did not get out until 2 years later because of his injuries. The Osage, who had been the tribe in Missouri that went to Oklahoma, they fought very bravely in World War II, and yet they were not granted benefits at the end of the war. They had to have legal representation and take several years to get benefits. In the meantime, all the other veterans are getting first pick of the college education, the low mortgages, getting their lives started. So there are Osage in Oklahoma that were set back because even though they served in the military, they did not get benefits. And of course, from the 1880s until the 1960s, there's the sad story of the Indian boarding schools. And I met a Shawnee from Oklahoma just a couple of falls ago in Perry County, Missouri, because we were at a dig at a Shawnee village down there that had existed. The person that founded Cape didn't want the Osage to be bothering Cape, so he brought in some Shawnees to act as a buffer. The Shawnees didn't want anything to do with fighting the Osage, so they lived there for about 40 years, but then they took off, and they're known as the absentee Shawnee, because the rest of the Shawnee ended up in Oklahoma. So there are two groups of Shawnee. But anyway, he told me just recently, he lived in Oklahoma off a dirt road, much like my father, and when there was a car that came down the road in the 40s, when he was born, maybe early 50s, his mother would tell him to go hide, and all the kids would go hide, because there might be somebody looking for kids for boarding school. So that has had a big impact. And of course, they were not very pleasant places. You couldn't speak your language. You weren't with your family. And a lot of times there was sexual and violent abuse there. So I've heard very similar stories across the U.S. and Canada as well in regards to the boarding schools. However, I will say this. In recent years, I've seen an awakening of truth concerning Native people in this land. And to move forward, we must know where we have been. Oftentimes, they may make us feel uncomfortable, these stories that I tell. I share some of these things not to make anyone feel guilty or ashamed. At one time, the country's resources were tabulated in metric tons of steel produced, or barrels of oil refined, or acres of land under cultivation. But today, in this world of instant communication, algorithms, and electronics, it is obvious that a country's people are its most important assets. The dominant culture's 4 cardinal directions are good for mapping property lines and ownership, capital, possession, boundaries, and extraction. My people, the Cherokee, have 7 cardinal directions. Besides north, east, west, and south, we have up, down, and here. Anytime you walk or trail, if you look at the path of stones in front of you and roots to avoid tripping over, you're not looking up to see the birds. And where you were 5 minutes ago is not where you are now. So the 7 cardinal directions are a much more powerful and useful way to experience the world. It is relational. And I knew of no other Native Americans when I graduated high school in West St. Louis County in 1970. Today in Missouri, I know them to be medical researchers, professors, engineers, social workers, artists, politicians, surveyors, flight attendants, and much more. So we need to be able to see each other clearly as human beings for us to relate to each other. The time of exploitation is over. From within our better natures, we must build bridges of understanding. With each new breath, we have a new chance. So the future of the first Americans, of Native Americans, is the same thing that all of Missourians need today to thrive. And that is civil behavior, good manners, kindness, knowledge, and acceptance. If your present or future is wrapped in fear, you need to get a new paradigm. This is not how we have been called to live. Wado. Thank you. Well, I feel pretty good because they said 50 minutes and it's 11:49. So, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So you said that there was different clans of the Cherokee.
Yes, ma'am.
Did they get along with each other?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so those different clans did.
When you're a tribal organization, you don't have a lot of people. Everybody is very important. And so you accept, nowadays with the way things are, if there was a woman in the tribe who had more man-like qualities about their personality, they were a warrior. And if there was a man in the tribe that had more, quote, whatever those are, feminine qualities, he took care of the kids. That's generally. Where that change was when the mission people came in and taught a Christian version of that. And so today in some, quote, traditional Indian societies, there's a strong sense against that. Now the younger Native people don't have that, but the ones born in the 40s and 50s might still have that. But back before that, with the tribe, and that's why quite often, yes, there was a lot of violence. There was, and of course that's true among any people, but you also adopted. Sam Houston, founder of Texas, was adopted by, he was Cherokee. When he lived in Tennessee and Kentucky, he lost his parents and he became part of the tribe. And he was always very, very proud of that. And so you often adopted people from other tribes. You could be cruel to some of them, you could kill them, but often you had to adopt in order to have enough boots on the ground to do the work and also have DNA choices. And captivity stories are really interesting. Certainly there were some children and women. They generally killed the men because they were seen as warriors, and of course they were shooting back at you while you were shooting at them. But quite often, if you look at the captivity stories, when they do recapture some of the women and children that were held by the tribes for years, they didn't want to go back to the white culture. They didn't want to wear a corset and behave and be stuck in the kitchen. They did a lot of hard physical work in the tribes, but there was a certain amount of respect, and they could see the immediate impact of what they were doing. So they got along. Most tribes did tend to get along. In fact, in our tribe, we had two chiefs, a war chief and a peace chief. And there was a woman, Nancy Ward, the beloved woman, who was very important in our tribal history. So we didn't have a lot of those kind of hang-ups. You did generally what worked. Any other questions?
How do all the tribes get together or work together now, from gambling to just general issues that they all face?
Well, that was one of the problems. Europeans tended to look at the Indian tribes as European nations. That's why you hear things like King Philip's or Cherokee Princess. There was none of that. There was no royalty or anything like that among the tribes. And so they had different languages, different cultures, different beliefs. So there was no unified. Tecumseh tried it, King Philip's tried it, to try to bring together some tribes to fight. The interesting story about Tecumseh, who was Shawnee from southern Indiana and Ohio, he went all the way down to North Carolina to talk to the Cherokees to join his confederation. And he told them, if you don't join, I'm going to stomp my foot on the ground when I get back to Indiana and Southern Ohio. And they talked about it for some time, and they decided they weren't going to travel all that way and fight the white man. They had enough trouble in their own neighborhood. Well, it took a while to travel back in those days, on horseback from North Carolina to Indiana. So by the time he got back there, New Madrid earthquake went off. And you could feel that in North Carolina because it rang church bells in Boston, right? They're thinking, oh my God, Tecumseh stomped his foot. We made the wrong decision. But generally, the first pan-Indian thing that was ever done among all the tribes was about the 1920s in Lawrence, Kansas, at Haskell, at that time, Institute. It's now Haskell Indian Nations College. Been there almost as long as KU on the south side of town. They built a stadium that Jim Thorpe played in because Jim Thorpe went to Haskell for a while. And it was a renowned stadium, and it was used by the city high school in Lawrence because it was a better stadium than what they had because it was a college. And but it's not being used now. So pan-Indian, there's not so much. And, not that all things are real rosy in the Indian country. I heard some of the Cherokees, who are considered very bright and very astute, talk about the Chickasaw being more astute. And so when you come across somebody more astute, you don't quite badmouth them, but, they're stingy, or they're this, or they're that. And they're just better at handling money than we are. And we're pretty darn good. And don't get me started on the Navajo or the Dene, because they really think they're something else. And one of the reasons is they've been down in their part of the world, and they didn't have that much contact with the whites for a long time. So they have more of an identity. We were on the East Coast, and we've had a lot more white influx, both of blood and culture and those kind of things. But that's also why, if you remember in Jurassic Park when he was explaining how they got the DNA for the dinosaurs, that they had to use some frog DNA because they couldn't get all the DNA out of the amber of the mosquitoes and things that they were using. Or the same thing today. Cherokees don't have turquoise. Cherokees didn't wear bolos. So there are certain things I've had to adapt to identify myself as a native person. And so there's some things you have to use because our culture was so destroyed that you have to use some pan-Indian things, powwows, for instance. My father would have never gone to a powwow. He thought that was for professional Indians. But the way it is today, I didn't grow up in a household speaking Cherokee. So I have to go places to find some root that relates something to my past or to Native people in general. But you do have to be afraid of appropriation. That is taking something that's not yours, and how that is defined, I don't know exactly. But I will tell you this, since my lovely wife is here, when I first started to date her and we talked about getting married, and my proposal was this: are we getting married or what? Of course, we'd been dating for 5 years. And luckily, she said yes. We were even in the car. I wasn't even kneeling. But anyway, I told her that when you tell people that I'm Cherokee, you will hear people say, I have a Cherokee grandmother or great-grandmother. And I said, you won't hear it a lot, maybe 10 or 12 times a year. It's never a male. It's never a grandfather or great-grandfather. And the percentage of statistics tell you it has to be half. And they will tell you this: she had long hair, which a lot of farm people had long hair, and she had high cheekbones. I'm thinking Turkish, Armenian, Italian, Jewish. I mean, there are a lot of people with high cheekbones, and they were dark. Turkish, Armenian, Italian, Greek. But anyway, that's the story. So among Native people, not only just Cherokees, but other people, it's kind of a joke. There's the Cherokee grandmother climbing your family tree. And I hear that quite often. And it's just one of those things. By the way, the guy that did the commercials in the 1970, Chief, I forget what his name was, but about pollution, he was in a canoe and then he saw more and more pollution. He was not Indian, he was Italian from Alabama. But he went out to Hollywood in the silent era and got cast as Indians, and then he started showing up in the sound movies. And by the time the 70s came, he was an old guy, and they thought he'd make a good elder. But they have his birth, his birth certificate from Alabama.
Hi, I'm just curious if there is any chance that parts of Missouri could be given to, as reservation land?
Well, I think the Osage are doing okay down in Osage County. I've met Jeff Standing Bear, their chief, and I consider myself friends with his advisor, Johnny, who, by the way, was a Green Beret in South Vietnam, and went through that. But he's just an old country guy. He's really nice, but he knows a lot about the Osage. I don't think there's enough interest, and I don't think Missouri necessarily wants to give up the land. And there's really not enough. I mean, with the Cherokees, I should know the figure off the top of my head, but it's about 360,000 Cherokees, and like 180 of them don't live in the 16 counties, and it's a small minority. I mean, it's like 116,000 live in the 16 counties of Oklahoma, the northeastern part, Fort Smith, Tahlequah, Muskogee, up to Tulsa. It's the prettier part, I think, because it's the foothills of the Ozarks. Not very much mountains, but anyway, most of us are what we call at large. We're in other places. Of course, we can hop on a plane and go to Russia or South Africa, or go to London, to go to Cambridge, or anything else, just like everybody else. Because sometimes people are surprised that there's so much fluidity of residency among Native people. But it's modern times.
The question I have, I read a book, and I believe it's in the bookstore here, The Osage in Missouri. But what I read is there was a two-pronged negotiations with the tribe, where first they said, well, we only need half your territory, and the second time, well, maybe three, we need all the rest of Missouri, and then finally push the tribe out of Missouri, as you stated, to Kansas. But there was also some community created in Missouri where they tried to assimilate,
No.
not the Osage assimilate, whoever was negotiating with them tried to assimilate them and maybe had a boarding school there. But my question again, you mentioned, in what year did you say the territory was negotiated away?
Well, I think the Osage left in 1808. Sometimes, again, it depends on which, the main tribe or a little band here, but the majority of them left in 1808. So 13 years before statehood.
Status of the repatriation of Native American bones vis-a-vis the state of Missouri?
Don't know that. That's a good question. Used to be when I used to go to museums as a kid in the 50s and 60s, first of all, they were boring. They'd just be glass cases with little type cards, and that's any museum, no matter what it was. And nowadays, they're really fascinating places. They have movies and holograms and great interpretation, and I think museums are really fascinating places today. But you would see Indian bones. You don't see them anymore. I don't see them. I think that started really in the 70s, so we're 50 years beyond that. I hope there's not a huge issue with that at this point. But it's not one that I'm aware of that's, on the forefront of people's minds, but I'm not an expert in that. I still have my bones.
Does the Cherokee Nation have a symbol that represents?
We have a seal, and in fact, I have a Cherokee flag at home at my house that I put out on the 4th of July, Memorial Day, and Labor Day. But it's a seal, and I think it's got 7 sides to it for the 7 clans. And you can find it on the Cherokee website, so it's easy to do. You don't have to ask a elder anymore. You can actually Google stuff now. So easy to do.
I have had Native American friends tell me that without Sacagawea, there would have been no Lewis and Clark expedition. Do you have a comment on that?
No, I mean, I don't have a comment on that. I did mention earlier, though, and I think to John, that Louisiana Purchase is kind of a funny thing to, because it's so big in St. Louis with the Gateway Arts and all that. And it was a big deal. But let's look at it this way. You sell this land, and you're in Paris, right, to these people in D.C. And, of course, the Lewis and Clark thing was to go out and find out what in the world they had bought. But nobody's asking the people that have lived here. So what if Saudi Arabia, like next year, sells Missouri to Russia? That's the same impact. And the Russians send a group of people to look around Missouri and say, oh, we kind of like this arch. We kind of like Kansas City. We don't see the purpose of Springfield, so we'll raise it. And, there's some good land out here in the middle of nowhere. Let's build something there. And you people are going to have to exit because we own this now. And that was the effect. Nobody asked the people that actually lived here. What you did, you show up and you planted a flag in somebody else's yard and said, this is ours. It's ludicrous when you think about it. But anyway, I do respect the historical significance of Lewis and Clark and what it meant to the country and to the state. But when on a larger view, you look at it, you go, what in the world? What's this mean? Anyway.
Not very patient. I have several Indian, I say family friends, and they refused at one time to carry around the $20 bill.
Yes.
Have you heard stories of that from your family?
Yes. Jacksena, that's Cherokee for Jackson the Devil. And so older Cherokees will say, I'll take the 10s, you keep the 20. Yeah. It's almost impossible for me to do that because the $20 bill is the most used bill in this country. They seem to come flying at you no matter what you do. So, I'm not rich. They come flying at me and go somewhere else. That's what happens generally. The gas company, insurance, kids. But it's the most used bill. I think it should have somebody else on it. Besides that, he's kind of strange looking, isn't he, with that hatchet, long face? Anyway. He seems to be the bully. Yes, he does. He does. And the interesting thing was there were Indians that helped him in his battles against the other Indians, and yet he turned against them. His life depended on them several times.
Hello, thank you. Really appreciate your perspective and experience. It's been an honor to listen. I'm wondering if you know of any resources, specific resources for local people to grow a deeper connection with the local people that lived here before, ecology and culture.
I think in some ways it's almost like going to college when you take econ or journalism. You start with the survey courses. Now, in some ways they can be hard because there's so much and it's not real deep, but you get a real good lay of the land. And then you can start drilling down into your junior and senior level courses, and if you're interested, go on to the master's. And then eventually you get a PhD where you can write about a little tiny bit of knowledge, But I think survey things are probably better. I'm not sure about a book about Missouri Indians per se. They were here for such a short time. They weren't even here when the state was founded as recognizable groups. So there's not going to be a really good book that you'll have to start going back to prehistory, which is archaeology, and that's magnificent work, but it's sketchy in a way. I don't mean sketchy like a bad deal at a dice game. I mean sketchy, there's not enough of it. So I think some good survey books, there are some recently. One is something about Beyond Wounded Knee. It's written by a Minnesota Indian, but it's really very good about what's happened since bury my heart at Wounded Knee. What's happened in this 1900s and the 20s? And he does some historical stuff as well. And there's a lady author, and John, what was the name of? Oh, he had to leave. Okay, a lady author that has 2 really good survey books out. But recently, there was a book by somebody who grew up in Columbia, went to Harvard, and he's a white gentleman, and he wrote a book about St. Louis. It's fascinating. Mainly it's about black history, but the first chapter or 2 are about Native history. And it's about how St. Louis is really a good microcosm of because we were neither north nor south, east nor west. When I grew up, nobody in St. Louis, you'd go to a business meeting, nobody would be wearing cowboy boots or a cowboy hat. Go to Kansas City, they would be, because they had stockyards and they had some money and they would go to the bank or go to a business meeting. And so you have this thing, and then of course we were a slave state, but we didn't participate in the southern side, although it was a miserable time to be in Missouri during that time. It was really lawless. Oklahoma was actually worse. A lot of family feuds and things like that were avenged. And of course, a lot of the people that signed the treaties for removal were slave owners. So a lot of the other tribal people who didn't want to move went after them during the Civil War. So it's interesting. An interesting, it should be a movie. The movie's in the can. It's not released yet, but it was based on a book, The Killings of the Flower Moon, which is about the Osage in once they get to Oklahoma. Now, first they go to Kansas, which is a good move, because they weren't forced to go to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears or during that period. When they did go, they went because white people wanted their land in Kansas, so they do go down to Oklahoma, but they know enough, times had changed, about mineral rights. So they preserve the right to the minerals. And then they discover all this oil underneath their land. And, starting about 1890 to 1920 or so, the Osage become the richest 2,000 people in the world, much richer than the Saudis are today. So that sounds okay, but they were considered wards of the state because they were considered children because they're Indians. So the people that are controlling their money are local bankers, storefront owners, hotel managers, neighbors of theirs that they grew up with. And so the Osage start driving around in Pierce Arrows and Packards, and they have white people as chauffeurs. White people are cleaning their homes. And they're not looking down their nose at this. They're just emulating what the rich white people do, right? And it really makes the white townspeople mad, and they start killing them in mysterious ways. The Osage murders, and no one could figure out what was going on. And it's a very interesting book. It also includes the FBI and how it started. But they made a movie with, what's his name, the Italian director, Scorsese made the movie with Leonardo I can't say his name. Yeah, him, and who's the other guy? The guy that was in Godfather, Robert De Niro. I think Robert De Niro plays a cowboy. That should be interesting. But anyway, it's been in the can for about a year or so, and it should come out one of these days. But it's very interesting. And to this day, in these small towns in Oklahoma, descendants of the Native people that were murdered might get their hair cut by the descendants of the person that murdered their grandfather. They live side by side, and sometimes they don't even know what their relationship is. So sadly, what it always comes down to is greed. It's just that. So, yes, that one. Yes, Broken Heart of America. It's just a general good read, but first couple of chapters are a good survey of plus you just learn all kinds of interesting things. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for the questions. And you all have a good rest of the day. Enjoy your Sunday.